Hello, my name is Bill Truels, and I'm a retired general surgeon in Oklahoma City. And I wanted to give you my analysis of the Huey Long assassination. There's basically three explanations I'm going to give you. One is the local explanation, another one is a national explanation, and the other is what I call a global explanation for why Huey Long was killed. Huey Long was in the capital, Baton Rouge, and was shot on a Sunday night around 9:30 on September 8th, 1935. He was involved in a discussion over gerrymandering of a district which would cause a certain individual, Judge Pavey, to lose his judgeship. This type of gerrymandering is common. It goes on all over the country, and the winner tries to realign the boundaries of the electorate to have the best chances of defeating their opponent. Judge Pavey had a son-in-law, Dr. Carl Weiss, who was a very successful surgeon in New Orleans, and was very fluent in German and French, quite articulate. He was a musician, he was a sculptor, and he was an excellent ear, nose, and throat surgeon. And he worked in Baton Rouge. As the official story goes, as Huey Long left the chambers and headed back towards his office, Dr. Weiss stepped out and threw a punch at Huey Long, hitting him on the lip. And Huey Long later asked, "Why did he hit me?" And subsequently, Long, who was surrounded by his bodyguards, including a Murphy Roden and a Joe Messina, then opened fire on Dr. Weiss and shot him. But in the melee that occurred, Huey Long was accidentally shot. He runs down the hallway, gets into a car, and gets a ride to where he is treated, and eventually undergoes a surgical exploration. There is a Dr. Arthur Vidrine, who is a New Orleans doctor at Charity Hospital, who happens to be, by sheer chance, in Baton Rouge that night, that Sunday night, getting ready to do some office business or procedure that he needed to do in the Capitol. And so Dr. Arthur Vidrine, who had been a long appointee at Charity Hospital, not known for surgical skills, then assumes the role of the person in charge. And he takes charge and takes Huey Long to surgery. There is a Dr. Cook, who is the more experienced surgeon. Dr. Cook is standing on the right side of Huey Long when they're operating, and so he's in the chief surgeon position. And Dr. Vidrine is in the first assistant position on the left side. They see a hole in Huey Long's right colon. There is an entry wound in the right upper abdomen. It misses the liver. It's below the liver. And it is repaired. There's two holes in the colon, and they're sutured closed. There's also noted to be some blood around the right kidney. And there's also noted to be an apparent exit wound in the right upper back. This is the official story. And subsequently, post-operatively, Huey Long continues to bleed. A decision is made, should they operate on him again or not. I should mention that Dr. Cook, before the operation is over, he's the chief surgeon on the case, the most experienced. He leaves before the operation is over, and Dr. Vidrine finishes the operation and closes. This is a little unusual for the surgeon in charge, the most experienced doctor, perhaps doing the most important case of his life, to leave the operation in the hands of the less experienced doctor to finish the operation. So we have Dr. Vidrine's word as to what all was found at the time of surgery, including a hematoma around the right kidney, which Dr. Vidrine chose not to explore. Afterwards, Huey Long bleeds. He's given a total of 5 units of blood in the next 30 hours. and continues to slowly drop his blood pressure, and then dies about 30 hours after he's shot. There was a discussion approximately 1 a.m., approximately an hour after the surgery was completed, as to whether additional exploration of the right kidney should be performed. Dr. Verdreen was in charge of the decision making. This is the least experienced doctor from a surgical standpoint, and he decides not to explore. Now, whether the other more experienced doctors there was a Dr. Mays who came in from New Orleans, who is one that Huey Long had requested to help to come in. He arrives about an hour after the operation's finished, and we don't know what his opinion was, but the decision by Dr. Verdreen, as Huey's blood pressure continued to drop, was to not explore. And it's believed that Huey died from slow progressive blood loss into what's called the retroperitoneal area, or the area behind the kidney. Despite receiving these 5 units of blood, his blood pressure continued to drop. Another possibility is that with the colon injured, there could have been some spillage of stool in the abdominal cavity. Huey Long's temperature did go up to 104 degrees before he died, and some people think it could have been a peritonitis that ensued following the surgery as a result of spillage of stool from the colon injury, and there's no report that the wound, the abdominal cavity, had been irrigated. At least it wasn't in the report. So Huey either died from blood loss, from ongoing blood loss in the retroperitoneal area behind the kidney, or he died from peritonitis with a temperature of 104, 30 hours after the operation. So the official initial explanation of Huey Long's assassination was that Governor Long, Senator Long, subsequently became a U.S. Senator at the time of his death, died as a result of gunshot from Dr. Carl Weiss, and that the bodyguards then shot Dr. Weiss. End of story. There's a few problems with the story. Dr. Weiss's gun was a .32 caliber gun, and the report was that Huey had a .38 caliber bullet in him, and Dr. Verdreen stated that he had pulled out a .38 caliber bullet. He gave it to his brother. His brother actually put it on a keychain. Now, what's interesting here is that if Huey died from a .38 caliber bullet and Dr. Carl Weiss's gun was a .32 caliber, then that means that Dr. Weiss didn't kill Huey Long. What happened subsequently, though, is that Dr. Weiss's gun disappeared for about 50 years, and people were not aware of this situation until relatively recently. So the explanation got changed. Now the explanation for Huey Long's murder was that he was accidentally shot by his bodyguard in the process of trying to shoot Dr. Weiss, and in the melee, Huey was accidentally shot. There's another problem, and that is that the initial story was that the bullet went completely through Huey from his right upper abdomen and exited out his right upper back. The problem was that Dr. Verdreen has a .38 caliber bullet which he gave to his brother to put on a keychain and don't talk about it. Subsequently, this information became known, and you then have a situation, well, if Dr. Verdreen pulled out a .38 caliber bullet, how do you explain the wound in Huey's back? So then another explanation was then offered, that Huey had been shot accidentally twice by his bodyguards, because the other talk was that the 2 bullets were a .38 and a .45, and Dr. Verdreen later confided to others that actually there were 2 bullets that were recovered from Huey's body, but neither one of them was a .32 caliber bullet. So now we have the story that Huey was accidentally shot twice by his own bodyguards. Another little wrinkle in the story, the official story, is that Dr. Weiss's brother, Tom Ed Weiss, when he heard about all the commotion at the Capitol, went to the Capitol there and saw his brother's car in the front. He looked in the car and nothing had been disturbed, but the car was locked. He didn't have a key. So Tom Ed goes back home, gets another key for the car, and comes back. When he comes back, he sees that his brother's car has been moved and that the glove compartment has been opened, and the brother's, Dr. Weiss's gun is gone from the glove compartment, and the car has been ransacked. The doctor's bag was opened, and so on. And the car, as I mentioned, had been moved from the front of the Capitol building over to the east side. So Tom Ed Weiss believes that the doctor's gun, Dr. Carl Weiss's gun, was retrieved after the assassination and put in his brother's hand. And he believes that his brother did not shoot or kill Huey Long. In addition, Dr. Alton Ochsner, one of the most prominent doctors of the day there in New Orleans, personally believed that Dr. Weiss did not shoot Huey Long. Another interesting point is that J. Edgar Hoover, of all people, happened to be on the phone to Baton Rouge for over an hour that night when the assassination occurred. Now, initially, people didn't realize who Dr. Weiss was. He wasn't recognized, and perhaps he had left his wallet in the car as well as his gun. It's not known, but immediately afterwards, they didn't know who this assassin was. J. Edgar Hoover is on the phone, and he says, "Well, that's Dr. Carl Weiss." And the police in the area wondered, well, how does J. Edgar Hoover know who this assassin is? And J. Edgar Hoover always believed that you needed to get the name out right away of an assassin, right during the initial period when the public was in shock after hearing the news of some famous person being killed. In addition, Walter Winchell was a prominent commentator of the day, and he had a Sunday night show. And the police are listening or happen to hear Walter Winchell on the radio on a Sunday night, and he announces that the assassin is Dr. Carl Weiss. And the police there in Baton Rouge in the building wonder, how do these people know who this man is? That his name is Dr. Carl Weiss. Well, eventually the gun apparently was retrieved, and perhaps the wallet, and subsequently it was confirmed that this was Dr. Carl Weiss. But how did J. Edgar Hoover know who the assassin was before the people there, the police there in Baton Rouge, could identify him? So that's an interesting little discrepancy that you have to wonder about. So now the official local story of Huey Long's assassination is that a disgruntled doctor, Dr. Carl Weiss, who was unhappy about his father-in-law's district being gerrymandered. His father-in-law was 61, Judge Pavey, and Judge Pavey's district was being gerrymandered, and Judge Pavey was going to be losing his judgeship. The son-in-law, a prominent physician and surgeon in Baton Rouge, is upset, goes to the Capitol building, throws a punch at Huey Long, and if he had a gun, somehow after throwing the punch with his right hand, had to somehow, even though the bodyguards were surrounding him, had to somehow then reach down and pull out a .32 caliber gun, or some gun of the wrong caliber, and somehow get the gun out and shoot Huey Long. And then the bodyguards turn around and shoot Carl Weiss, and in the process they actually shoot Huey Long twice. Then with regard to the surgery, there's a Dr. Vidrine who was a political appointee at Charity Hospital of Dr. Long's, happens to be in Baton Rouge at the time on a Sunday night and takes charge of the management of Huey Long's surgical management. And he's not a qualified surgeon. He has the least experience of any of the other doctors that were involved. But he runs the show, and he makes the decision that they will not reoperate. And whether this was right or wrong is hard to say. But the current thinking is that probably Huey should have been re-explored, and the bleeder and the retroperitoneum found and tied off or packed off. But that in the chaos of the whole situation, that the wrong decision had been made, and Huey Long then died as a result of a local New Orleans conflict that resulted in Huey's death. Next we have what I call the national explanation for Huey Long's assassination. Huey Long had announced 1 month before his death that he was going to run for president. He had a strong ally in a man named Father Coughlin, who was a Catholic priest who was quite a strong radio supporter of Huey Long and was quite eloquent in his speeches. In addition, Huey himself was very good on the radio, a natural salesman for his political ideas. He had ideas for share of the wealth, which he called, where $5,000 would be awarded to each family from the oil company profits and awarded to each family in Louisiana, and later he extended it to the whole country, that the whole country should share the wealth of the oil companies in particular. And this seems far-fetched, but I know in Alaska today this distribution is done. Each family in Alaska gets something like a couple $1,000, or each person, each individual gets something like $1,000 each year from the oil revenues. So, but Huey was way ahead of his time in that regard, and was not at all popular as a result with the oil companies. FDR felt that Huey Long was the second most dangerous man in the country, and there's debate as to whether the most dangerous man was another possible political opponent, General MacArthur, or perhaps he was referring to Father Coughlin. There's debate among the historians about it, but the point is that FDR felt that Huey was a danger to the society, and he appointed internal revenue agents to go over Huey's tax records and also Huey's supporters' tax records and threaten them with imprisonment. In addition, FDR put a FBI surveillance, not protection, but FBI surveillance on Huey Long, and wherever Huey Long went, the FBI was following. So J. Edgar Hoover was closing in on Huey, following his activities, and very closely, and FDR, with his internal revenue, was threatening to put Huey's supporters and perhaps even Huey himself in jail. So there was quite a bit of rivalry on the part of FDR towards Huey Long. And the question arises whether FDR, through J. Edgar Hoover, was able to somehow manipulate the local situation with Judge Pavey and Dr. Carl Weiss, and turn that into a local excuse for what really was a national motivation for Huey Long's assassination. Now, people say we don't live in a banana republic. A sitting president would never think about killing his political rival. That could never happen. But there was a very deep resentment on the part of FDR and a number of the politicians, both Democrat and Republican, against this polarizing Huey Long figure who had really taken over the state of Louisiana. And in a letter to a comrade, a fellow traveler, FDR had written that he was very concerned that if Huey were to win the election in 1936, that by 1940 he'd have the country turned into a total dictatorship with Huey as the president, as Huey would fire all of FDR's appointments and put in his own people and consolidate his power. Now, FDR himself was not above trying to consolidate his power, as we know. He did a thing called court packing, where he put additional justices on the Supreme Court, which was later ruled illegal, but was an attempt by FDR to himself gain control of the country, a very strong control of the country during his 4 terms as president. So there was a rivalry with FDR, and the question arises whether FDR, through J. Edgar Hoover, was able to manipulate the local situation in such a way that it would appear to be a local argument, resulting in Huey's demise over a gerrymandering issue, when in fact the manipulators were occurring and manipulating at a national level in order to rid themselves of a man who they felt was a danger to the country. Next, we have what I would call the global explanation for Huey's demise. And stick with me on this one. Basically, FDR was a proponent of involvement in world affairs. He was a strong proponent, for example, of us going to war during World War I and fighting the Germans. He had written a letter as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to Winston Churchill before World War I started, and he said, "What if the Lusitania were to sink?" And the idea being that some major catastrophic event would stimulate the United States to get involved in a European war against Germany. Subsequently, many months later, the Lusitania was sunk by the Germans. Some people think there was gun cotton on board, and that maybe caused it to sink faster. But later, months later, when we did go to war and declare war against Germany, in Wilson's the idea to make the world safe for democracy, in fact, the battle cry was "Remember the Lusitania." Now, subsequently, FDR was watching the rise of Adolf Hitler, and he felt that really Huey Long was just another Adolf Hitler in the process of developing. He equated the two individuals, and this is quite a dramatic statement to make for a president, to equate his political opponent to Adolf Hitler. And he really believed that Huey was a danger, and Huey was an isolationist. Huey did not even believe that we should have gone to war against Germany for World War I. He thought that was a mistake, and he certainly, with Hitler being on the rise, FDR had again expressed the views in a written letter that he was concerned that if Huey did win the election in 1936, and Hitler continued to expand his power and his influence and started taking over other countries, that Huey would not be in favor of going to war with Hitler under any circumstances. And FDR, on the other hand, felt that even in 1936, he felt that there were efforts being made to help England and supply them with materials against a growing German threat. So FDR, in a sense, was ahead of his time and foreshadowing the need for a Second World War. I believe that it was right for us to have gone to war against Germany. But if Huey Long were president, it's very possible that the country might not have been mobilized to go to war with Germany if you had a president that said, no, we're not going to do this. So FDR, from a global standpoint, viewed Huey Long as a threat to world peace, if you will, in the sense that if Hitler did continue to flex his muscles, that in fact we might very well need to go to war. And Hitler at that time, 1936, was already beginning to persecute minorities. Albert Einstein had left in 1933 due to religious persecution, and other minorities that Hitler was attacking as he continued to expand his power. And there was a real concern about Hitler's rise to power, and the concern that Huey Long was not going to be the man to, with his isolationist views, was not going to be the man to support a possible developing war against Germany in World War II. So again, FDR was quite motivated to see that Huey Long did not become president in 1936. The question is, how was FDR and J. Edgar Hoover able to manipulate a local situation to result, namely the Dr. Carl Weiss, and manipulate them into the desire to create a local melee, a local plot to kill Huey Long and cover up for the involvement at a national level? How were they able to do this? Now, what I'm going to do in this final section is to provide you a very controversial explanation for Huey Long's demise that involves the globalist viewpoint. I cannot verify that this is a correct explanation. I can only say that it's out there, and it's up to the reader and the researchers really to determine, could this really have happened this way? This is a conspiracy explanation. If you're not a conspiracy theorist, you might as well just turn off the video, because this is a real conspiracy theorist presentation. And I cannot verify it. I can only tell you that this explanation is out there. There is an article that appeared in February 18th, 2010 by Mimi Eustice, E-U-S-T-I-S, whose father was Samuel Todd Churchill. And on his deathbed, Samuel Todd Churchill, who was a member of the 33rd Order of the Masonic group, in tape recordings that she made on her father's deathbed, dying of, I believe, of lung cancer, and gives things that need to be checked out as to whether they could be true or not true. The Skull and Bones is a society, a secret society. The Illuminati is a secret society. People say, well, they don't exist. But we know, for example, that every year the Bilderbergs meet in so-called New World Order once a year, and the news media even gives their names of the people who attended. There are politically active groups that are wealthy, and that at times it's felt that a democracy doesn't always provide the best leader, and that the country has to be pushed or pulled one way or another to be guided in the right direction. A lot of times these political activists could be correct. For example, if in fact the United States was guided away from Huey Long and towards FDR, resulting in a president who supported getting involved in World War II, then that was a good thing. At the time that FDR was wanting to go to war against Germany in World War II, 80% of the American people were opposed to it. So you had to have something done, something happen to try to convince people that they needed to go to war against Germany. So I'm not saying that this type of thinking isn't necessary, that this type of political activism sometimes supersedes democratic ideas and beliefs, because people believe that the democracy has to be guided in a certain direction. The article talks about Rudy Matas, who was a very prominent surgeon and very highly respected, but also a very strong political activist, a very strong anti-communist, and on the order of, for example, J. Edgar Hoover, a very strong anti-communist after World War II. this Rudy Matas was a member of this 33rd degree. Another grouping with it is the Mystic Crew of Comus. Again, these are groups that are not politically active necessarily. They make floats once a year, and they're social groups. But when you get to the higher order in these groups, there is a level that the other 99% of the people don't know about. It states in this article that the Masons were used by the Illuminati Skull and Bones as a disguise, and that those who passed into the 33rd level were part of this very active political group that did a blood allegiance. And once you were a member of this group with the blood allegiance, you were obliged to do what the group asked you to do if in fact you were chosen for a particular action. Now, Rudy Matas was a very prominent surgeon in New Orleans at Tulane, and his understudy was Dr. Carl Weiss. And Rudy Matas assisted Carl Weiss in his development and growth as a surgeon, and then also helped to get him sent to Paris and Austria, where he met other members of the 33rd level Illuminati order. Now, are there political activists that may not be Illuminati? Sure. Do they meet in certain areas around the world? Sure. They're political activists. They often have a lot of money, or some of them do, and help finance some of these efforts. But Carl Weiss was introduced to these political activists. He saw what was going on in Germany, in Austria. He saw with the religious persecution going on there and getting worse. And under the tutelage of Rudy Matas, Dr. Weiss's wife ended up also going to Paris, and there she met Dr. Weiss, and they did marry. So Matas was sort of the, I guess, sort of the man who was in charge of developing Dr. Weiss, not only as a good surgeon, but also making him aware of the world situation and the political activism that was necessary if you were going to be part of the world. In fact, Dr. Alton Ochsner, also at Tulane, made the statement many times that a good surgeon was also going to be an active political person, that he had to be somebody that was concerned about the world at large. And Dr. Ochsner took world leaders from Central and South America that came to his clinic, and saved many lives by flying them in to the clinic and treating them. And Dr. Ochsner was a very strong political activist. But we're talking here about Rudy Matas and his political activism. He was one of the original speakers at the Skull and Bones in New Orleans. And in addition, they mentioned that Dr. Arthur Vidrine was a Rhodes Scholar of the New World Order Skull and Bones Illuminati, that he had a Rhodes Scholar from Cecil Rhodesia Rhodes, who established a cell of Skull and Bones titled the Round Table. So Dr. Arthur Vidrine was a political activist, not simply a Huey Long political appointee and physician, but also politically active. So the story then evolves that J. Edgar Hoover is aware of the political activists, and in fact the article mentions that he himself, and again this is something that's going to have to be researched, was a 33rd level Mason, as well as FDR were involved in this. Now, just because you're a 33rd level Mason, which is the very exclusive group, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be involved in assassinations or anything like that. It just means that you're going to be politically very active. And a person who takes action, if they see a political figure coming to the forefront like Adolf Hitler, who they feel is going to be a threat to the world peace. Now, a situation arises that hadn't been planned on. Sometimes during an assassination attempt, things don't go the way they're planned. Huey Long is shot twice. He's been operated on, but he's still alive. And the last thing that the planners wanted was for Huey Long to become a national hero and survive an assassination. He was bleeding internally, and Dr. Vidrine was opposed to a second operation. According to this national explanation and the global explanation that I've given, Dr. Vidrine would not be interested in re-exploring. The problem was that Dr. Vidrine was not an experienced surgeon. In fact, he was a general practitioner who did some surgery. After the first operation, the more experienced surgeons came in, and an argument ensued because they felt that Huey needed to be re-explored, that he was bleeding internally, most likely from this retroperitoneal bleed. And an argument ensued. Dr. Vidrine said, no, I'm opposed to operating again. The problem is that Dr. Vidrine is not really a very experienced surgeon. He's a family practice, general practice doctor. And these surgeons that are arguing with him are much more experienced. Dr. Vidrine had wanted to become a ear, nose, and throat chairman at Tulane when that position became open. And Dr. C.C. Bass said, well, Dr. Vidrine, you're not experienced in ear, nose, and throat surgery. How can you be the chairman of the department at Tulane? And Dr. Vidrine replied, well, I'll read up on it. And then subsequently after that, Dr. Vidrine, sometime later, approached Dr. Ochsner at Tulane about becoming a professor of surgery. And again, the problem was that Dr. Vidrine was not really qualified to be a professor of surgery because he didn't have the experience. So here you had these more experienced doctors that now arrived, the surgeons, and said Huey needs to be re-explored. And Dr. Vidrine was opposed to it. But what do you do if you're J. Edgar Hoover? The last thing you want is for Huey Long to survive and become a national hero, not just a state hero of the state of Louisiana, but now a national hero if he survives an assassination. So one thing that is very possible is that J. Edgar Hoover calls his FBI agents down there in Baton Rouge and says, I'm giving you orders not to let Huey go back to surgery. Now that sounds preposterous. How can FBI agents give advice or orders to surgeons, experienced surgeons? Who has the power? And it reminds me of an episode in the John Kennedy assassination where Dr. Rose, the medical examiner, said, "You're not taking this body out of Texas. Texas state law says you've got to let me do the autopsy. That's a Texas state law." And according to Dr. Crenshaw that I talked to at the time, said, well, what happened was the Secret Service agents, the FBI agents that were around, literally threatened Dr. Rose. Some of them put their hands on their guns, and according to Dr. Crenshaw, some of them even pulled out their guns. And Rose was forced to step aside and let John Kennedy's body be transferred out of Dallas. So it is possible, and we know that with Huey Long, he was under FBI surveillance, and the FBI agents were present. They were on orders to keep him in their sight, and they were even in the operating room, which is usually not allowed. And the FBI agents then approached the surgeons and said, "You're not going to take Huey Long back to surgery," and their opinion won out. Now, is there any evidence for this that this could have happened? We don't have very much. Again, this is another area where I'm speculating, but there was a report. Author Ed Reed in Requiem for a Kingfish stated that mobster Frank Costello told underworld boss Meyer Lansky several weeks later after the assassination. They were in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and Costello said, "We could have saved him, but I didn't see much use in it. The doctors had their orders to let him die." Now that sounds preposterous that the doctors could be ordered by Washington to not re-explore Huey Long. But certainly there would be a motivation for J. Edgar Hoover and FDR to not have Huey survive, and in the process of trying to get rid of a political opponent who they felt was the second most dangerous man in the country, turn him into a national hero. That was something that they weren't going to do. And so in effect, you had to think that the two lane doctors that wanted to operate must have concluded the fix was in, and that Huey was just not going to survive because of politics, not because of surgical decisions. And here again, this in a way lets Dr. Verdreen somewhat off the hook, because even though he was not in favor of re-exploring, it wasn't just a matter of his judgment that was the blame for Huey's demise. It was that the fix was in from Washington, and it didn't matter what the surgeons thought should be done. The fix was in, and Huey was not going to get re-explored. And some of Huey's last words were, "Please don't let me die." Huey knew that he was going downhill, and if anything, he might have wanted a second operation to stop the bleeding, but that was not to be. There's an interesting question that arises when you're discussing Huey Long. Was he a right-wing populist, or was he a left-wing activist? If you read the history books today, there's usually only a short paragraph on Huey Long, if he's discussed at all. But he's described as a right-wing populist in some, a right-wing activist, a fascist, in some cases a right-wing dictator. They ask all these questions, and yet you look at some of the issues that Huey Long supported. He was in favor of free textbooks for the schools, sponsored by the government. He was in favor of free college education and vocational training, sponsored by the government. He was very popular with the Louisiana population, and really the whole country. He had 8 million members in this Share the Wealth clubs around the country. He had 20 million radio listeners. He would get 60,000 letters a week in the mail, and yet you hardly read about him in the history books. It's quite interesting. The roads and bridges in Louisiana were in high speed on the orders from Huey Long. He built the Capitol building in Baton Rouge. He was in favor of building charity hospitals and have free health care for the poor. Yet he's called a right-wing activist, a right-wing dictator in many of these textbooks. Well, you ask yourself, well, who were his opponents? Well, one was the oil companies, Standard Oil. Why was Standard Oil opposed to Huey Long? Well, he wanted to take their profits and distribute them $5,000 apiece to the families around the country. Today, we'd probably call that socialism. He was in favor of promoting the common man. He was in favor of the blue-collar worker, and that they receive adequate wages. He was pushing for a 30-hour work week instead of a 40-hour work week. The unions really were in favor of Huey Long. The state Democrats in Louisiana were opposed to him. Many of them were. There was a episode called Bloody Monday. And what happened there was that the Democrats in the Louisiana legislature were trying to impeach Huey Long because he wanted to impose an increased oil tax on the oil companies and distribute that money to the population. And his own state Democrats tried to impeach him over this on an issue called Bloody Monday. In the national level, he couldn't get his reform legislation passed. The joke was among his fellow Democrats in D.C. that he couldn't get the Lord's Prayer passed if he proposed it. That they were all opposed to his populist legislation. It's credited by some that Social Security, which FDR was initially opposed to, was really pushed through because a result of Huey Long and pushing FDR to the left, they say, and promoting Social Security pensions. And that some of FDR's proposals were a result of Huey Long's pressure. Now, another opponent of Huey, besides the oil companies, was there was a very popular man named William Donovan, and he was a war hero in World War I and subsequently in World War II. And between the two wars, he was one of FDR's strongest advisors. Later became a Republican, but he traveled Europe and watched the rise of Adolf Hitler and reported back to FDR and said, in 5 more years, we're going to be at war with Germany and we better prepare for it. Donovan was no isolationist, and really, even though FDR at one time called himself a pacifist, in fact, he was in favor of a war against Germany should the situation arise and Germany try to take over Europe. So William Donovan predicted to FDR that there would be a war with Germany, and he was one of FDR's closest advisors. Now, the intelligence agency, William Donovan, later gave rise to the OSS, which later gave rise to the CIA. Intelligence agencies were not real keen on Huey Long because some of these adventures in Central and South America, Huey Long was opposed to, that the oil companies would influence the government, in some cases influence coups through the intelligence agencies that would promote these companies, not only the oil companies, but also agricultural products such as bananas. And there would be our intelligence agencies promoting particular governments outside of our country in favor of these large multinational corporations. In some respects, Huey Long was a successful trial lawyer. He was in favor of workman's comp and sued corporations on the behalf of individuals who had their civil rights violated. He was one of the first people to sue these large corporations, one of the first trial lawyers. Yet most trial lawyers today consider themselves to be more left-wing. Yet they label Huey as being right-wing. So I leave it to the viewer to try to determine. But sometimes when people get labels, you have to question those labels. If someone today were to run on all these issues that Huey proposed, he'd be considered a radical left-wing activist. So I think that's interesting how he's portrayed in the history books. Another opponent of Huey Long was the Federal Reserve. Huey Long was in favor of abolishing the Federal Reserve. The Morgans and the Rockefellers had stock in the Federal Reserve, and he viewed this as an unwise practice and was very much opposed to the Federal Reserve, a lot like John Kennedy later. Huey Long was opposed to these bankers and the big profits they were making, as well as the oil companies and their big profits. We had a company in Oklahoma that a couple of years ago reported a third quarter profit of $800 million. And you have to ask yourself, gee, is that right for one oil company to make a profit of $800 million? And you have to say, well, maybe Huey had some good ideas with regard to increasing taxes on some of these fantastic profits that are made by these large corporations. Wouldn't that money be better served being distributed to help the Social Security Trust Fund and issues like that? But Huey's portrayed as a right-wing populist or dictator, yet today I think most people would call him a left-wing activist. The Huey Long assassination raises some interesting philosophical questions. We live in a democracy, but are we being manipulated by people who think they know better, that can give us the right direction to choose for our candidates? Are we really living in a democracy if our viewpoints are being influenced by outside forces that don't want us to know that they're around. In 1939, The Wizard of Oz movie came out based on a story by Frank Baum, and this was 4 years after Huey's assassination. The end of the story, you see a wizard behind a curtain, and he's manipulating rods and levers and lights and smoke and everything to make people behave or believe a certain way to create the world around them without them knowing it. And the question arises whether in our democracy there aren't people who think, well, Huey Long wasn't going to be right. If he's an isolationist and a war develops in Europe, who's going to stop Adolf Hitler from taking over all of Europe? And is Huey Long the right choice, even though he's the popular choice among the people? Do the people always know in a democracy who the best choice is going to be? Do they always know better than other people that are maybe more knowledgeable, perhaps in the intelligence agencies or at the higher levels of government? So it raises the question, are we in control of our own democracy? Now there's another side to this point. Look at Germany and the rise of Adolf Hitler. Look how popular he became, yet he was obviously a bad choice for world peace. Millions of people died as a result, obviously, of World War II. So perhaps it's necessary to have these assassinations occur in order to guide the people in the right direction. No, I'm not meaning to equate Huey Long with Adolf Hitler, not by any means. But I'm simply saying that perhaps if Huey were elected, and would it be a good idea to get rid of the Federal Reserve like he wanted to? Would it be a good idea to dissolve the oil companies and nationalize them and distribute all their profits? Would it be a good idea to be an isolationist at a time when world events might demand otherwise? Remember, when Huey was alive, there was an 80% opinion that we should not go to war in Europe again after World War I. So Huey's viewpoints were very popular. And the question is, are the popular viewpoints going to necessarily be the correct viewpoints? So I raise these issues that perhaps a lot of our history, which is written by the victors, did not occur exactly the way it's portrayed in the history book. Perhaps Huey Long's murder was not just a local Louisiana affair, but that the people in Louisiana were manipulated, if you will, into the assassination by those in Washington who had a larger goal in mind and claimed to be more knowledgeable than the people at large. So these are questions that will always be raised by these assassinations. Now, a complete analysis of the Illuminati, as they call themselves, or the enlightened ones, actually basically political activists with money, can be seen by author Jim Marrs, who goes into exquisite detail about their existence. And again, the official media even deny their existence, and yet they mention that, well, once a year they meet in the Bilderbergs and give the names of the people that meet. But officially, according to the media, a lot of these things simply don't exist. But Jim Marrs goes into a lot of detail with the Illuminati and the history, which we'll not go into here, but suffice it to say that you have a group of political activists who feel very strongly about their political views and take action accordingly. Now, I'm going to drop another difficult thing to accept, and that is that one of Huey Long's bodyguards, according to this story, Murphy Roden, again, I can't vouch for this. They claim that he was a spy for J. Edgar Hoover, was on the payroll, and was involved in shooting Huey Long and Dr. Weiss. Again, I can't vouch for this. I'm saying that this is the outline that was given by Mimi Eustace, as told by her father, Samuel Churchill, who was a member of this clandestine group, the Mystic Crew of Comus, but again, at the highest level, the top 1% of the Masonic individuals. So the way that this would have to go down is that FDR talks to J. Edgar Hoover and says, we've got to take action against Huey Long. What can we do? He's announced that he's running for president. He's got a very popular group of people supporting him. He's got local grassroots people in every state who are organizing for him. What can we do? And J. Edgar Hoover then, who has Huey under FBI surveillance, is able somehow to perhaps offer money to Murphy Rodin, or also another bodyguard mentioned has been Joe Messina. Again, I can't prove any of this, I'm just speculating. That's what's, nobody in this article mentions Joe Messina, although he does confess to others that he may have shot Huey Long by accident. The way that this goes down then is that J. Edgar Hoover talks to Rudy Matas, who is like the senior political activist and also the most prominent surgeon in the area, though now he's older, he's retired, and others have taken his place in surgery, but he still is around, is still politically active, and Rudy Matas had said to numerous people that he had a consuming hatred for Huey Long. And he said this even years after Huey's demise. There were no regrets about his demise. But that's not to imply that he would take action against Huey Long. But again, in this scenario, Matas talks to Carl Weiss, who's been sort of a mentor of Dr. Weiss. And Dr. Weiss is a very serious scholar. He's an accomplished musician, and he's a sculptor, and he's a fantastic surgeon, and he's like 30 years old, and he's become chairman of the medical society. But again, he's been groomed by Matas. He's been to Paris, he's been to Vienna, and he's met other political activists, and he sees what's going on in Germany and the religious persecution going on there, and he's joined this clandestine group, this Illuminati, the Enlightened Ones. And not only is he an active surgeon, but in the same manner as Matas and Ochsner also, they believe that a good surgeon is also a politically active individual. That doesn't mean that they're going to shoot somebody, however. It just means that they're involved in politics of the day. And Carl Weiss was actively involved in the politics of the day, as well as being all these other things. And Matas goes to his understudy, Carl Weiss, and he says, Carl, a situation has come up, and I'm speculating here as to how this conversation occurred, but Matas would say to him, a situation has come up where something has to be done about Huey Long, and the group has decided that this situation with your father-in-law, the gerrymandering, is a perfect excuse for you to be in the Capitol building when Huey gives his speech for the gerrymandering of Judge Pavey's district, and we want you to be angry and upset about it and throw a punch at Huey Long. That's all you have to do, is throw a punch at Huey Long and then get out of there. And Carl Weiss is no fool. He knows that he has allegiance to this group, that he's obliged to follow what they say, and he says, let me get this straight. You want me to throw a punch at Huey Long? How is that going to make any difference? And Matas says, don't worry about it, the bodyguards will do the rest. And Carl Weiss is no fool, and he says, you're talking about the assassination of Huey Long. And Matthias says, something's got to be done. So Carl Weiss probably thinks about it, and according to this article by Mimi Eustace, he balks about it. He objects to it. He says, wait a second. He says, yeah, I'm a member of this group. I'm an active member. I've sworn allegiance. I've given a blood oath. But I just don't think this is right, and I certainly don't think I should be the one to throw the punch at Huey Long. Can't you get somebody else to just throw a punch at him? And Matthias says, this is if you will, a play. You're an actor on the stage, and your role in this action is to throw that punch because it's your father-in-law that is losing his judgeship over this gerrymander. It's the perfect excuse for you to throw a punch at Huey Long. And Carl thinks about it and says, I'm just not going to do it. I'm sorry, Rudy. I'm not going to do it. And then, according to this article, Dr. Weiss is threatened, and he says, if you don't do it, you will be killed, as will your newborn 3-month-old son. This is what's, again, indicated in the article. In other words, Carl Weiss has no choice in this matter. He's signed on to this group. He's sworn a blood allegiance. And he's been designated to create this false event, if you will, in justification for the melee to occur and for Huey to accidentally be shot. And Rudy maybe even says, well, what if, Dr. Weiss may say, well, what if, okay, let's say Huey gets shot, then he may survive the surgery. What's the deal here? And Rudy says, well, we've got that taken care of too. You don't worry about that. And again, I'm going by what's in the article, that Dr. Vidrine, who's a longtime political appointee of Huey Long, but in later years tried to get on the staff at Tulane as a professor of surgery, is involved in this situation as well. And the article mentions that throughout history, doctors have been involved in these politically active activities. And you'll have to read the article yourself. It talks about the Lincoln assassination and other issues that may also have been involved with these conspiracies of these very wealthy, politically active individuals. But the interesting thing is that Carl Weiss has no choice. He's signed into this politically active group, and if he doesn't do the little stage play that he's supposed to do and throw that punch, then his son will be killed, or he's threatened that his son will be killed. And maybe even Matthias says, look, all you got to do is throw that punch and get out of there, get in your car and drive away. And maybe that was part of the original plan. But the problem would be that there would be a trial. If Carl Weiss lived, there would be a trial. And if there's a trial, just like if Oswald had lived, there would be a trial. And if there's a trial, certain things may come up that don't jive. For example, the caliber of Dr. Weiss's gun was wrong for the bullets that were in Huey Long, according to Dr. Vidrine, who said it was a .38 caliber bullet, according to Dr. Vidrine's brother. And he had the bullet on his keychain, the brother did. So Weiss really had no choice. Dr. Weiss really had no choice. And I think he accepted his fate, and perhaps he felt that he was, in a way, probably a martyr in the views of some, because if Huey Long had become president, it's very possible that we never would have gone to war with Germany. And it's interesting that Hitler was also developing an atomic bomb. And they even had an explosion, but the explosion, the nuclear explosion, occurred too quickly, and the bomb blew apart and became, in effect, a radiation bomb. And the prisoners who had been placed around the bomb died of radiation. So the Germans were on to the atomic bomb. They just had to figure out a way to take the uranium and smash it together fast enough to keep the bomb from blowing apart too soon and not undergoing enough fission. And Hitler even said, God forgive me, the last few minutes of this war, indicating that if he had the atomic bomb, he was going to use it. And he wasn't going to make any bones about using it. So I think it was important that FDR was president at the time that Pearl Harbor occurred, and that we did go to war with Germany. And perhaps this globalist explanation does make sense. But again, I cannot vouch for its accuracy, and I cannot vouch for its authenticity. This will be something that researchers will have to do. Was Dr. Matas a 33rd Mason? Was Carl Weiss a 33rd Mason? Was J. Edgar Hoover and FDR 33rd degree Masons? These are things that, if you do research on these individuals, I haven't been able to find out if that was the case or not. And even if it was the case, does that mean that they were involved in this conspiracy to assassinate Huey Long? So those are the three views that I've given you. The local explanation, which has a few loose ends that don't quite make sense. The national explanation, that FDR felt that this share of the wealth program, distributing the money from the oil companies, was not the way to solve our social problems. And then the national explanation involving our potential involvement, which did eventually occur 5 years later in World War II against Germany. Again, it'll be up to the researchers to try to verify which of these explanations is correct or which combination is correct. And I don't vouch for the authenticity of this global explanation, but I'm just putting it out there for other researchers to do their work and find out, if they can, whether this can be verified or not. Thank you.